Welcome back. I just finished a jam map, so it's time for my obligatory I just made a jam map video where I just waffle on about the stuff I did for the jam. So let's just get on to it. This is Bitfield, the third and possibly final map in the Bit series. The Bit series being jam maps that Adri and I make, generally CTMs. And I'm just going to talk about some stuff I did for this. I think first I'm going to start off by ignoring the UI stuff that's going on. There's that colored crosshair, there's that little icon. I'm going to take this off so we don't get that icon anymore. So I'm going to start off by talking about the core movement mechanic in the map, which is the hook shot here. Just going to take this off of my offhand so I can focus on it a little bit. So this is a hook shot. As it says, you right click and just go to where you're aiming. And that's basically the mechanic, but how it's executed is using a library called Delta. I forget who it's made by, but there's a GitHub repository for it, and I'll have it linked in the credits of this map. The download link for it will be in the description. It'll be up on Crowdford. And you can go ahead and check it out. It's a very difficult map, so if difficult CTMs are not your thing, then skip it, I guess. Watch a playthrough if there's any out there. But basically, this uses the Delta library, which is a thing that you can give it a number and run a function, and it will set your velocity for you. There's two modes. There's the X, Y, and Z mode where you can set specific velocity values to be applied to the player, and then there's the facing where you give it a number for the velocity you want to move and an angle, which is the execution angle, and it will propel you in that direction. And that's what I use for this. I take the player's facing angle, well, not directly, I do a raycast, and at that position I will summon an entity above it and then face back to the player. Summoning the entity isn't particularly required, but I do that for, I forget why, it's been a few days since I've programmed it, but basically I then if it's at a block that it has air above it, it will summon an entity above it and then face back to you, invert the rotation. So instead of aiming here, it'll aim here. So I end up on this block instead of bouncing against it. And stuff like that. There's a few little things here and there to make this a little more manageable. So there's that first impulse, which moves you to that location. And then there's a second impulse after 10 ticks, which is about half of the speed. So the actual speed I apply is the distance times 20. It's the distance times 2, although technically the distance is already innately times 10, and then I multiply it by 200. But the number that the pack asks for is the distance per block, or the distance in blocks per tick times 10,000. So I already sort of have innately those multiplications in place by the distance raycast being 10 steps per block. And then I have the times 200 to make it at the right scale. And basically that makes it so you go the distance from where you're standing to the block you're aiming at in about 10 ticks. And after that 10 ticks, I apply a second impulse that is about half the speed, so that you can have a little bit of momentum out of it, but not an uncontrollable amount of momentum. I also have an FOV change, which was actually from the first version of this, where I had a minecart. It was basically the Iron Garden hook shot, but I had the impulse, the motion impulse afterwards. But that had a few issues, specifically being sometimes you just don't enter a minecart when you right-click a minecart. So that being that, it felt horrible. So what I did is I just didn't use a minecart. I just did both impulses using Delta, and it feels way better. It's an amazing system, and it's just, there's a lot of complexities to it, and there's a lot to learn. And that's the main movement mechanic. And that's basically the only data pack tech I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk a little bit about shaders. There's also the main weapon tech. Well, not really tech. The main weapon system, which is a weapon that switches from a sword to a crossbow. And that's the main combat loop. But that is its own thing, but it's not very complicated, and I don't really feel like it's necessary to talk about. There's a bunch of complexities. I could probably do a freaking hour-long video talking about all the weird stuff you can do and all of the, like, synergies with all the upgrades and stuff. I could do a developer commentary like I said I was going to do with Bitstream, but I don't think I'm going to make any promises. But what I'm going to move on to is the resource pack tech, specifically a few shaders that I wrote for this. I guess I'm going to start with the HUD, which is the most basic. It's just a fairly simple shader that removes the shadow on text if I set a specific text color. And that's because, or I have to do that because all of the like UI elements are on a title. That's why, or that way it is anchored to the center of the screen, because otherwise it wouldn't be reliably on the crosshair. The crosshair itself is actually a font item, and then the grapple charges underneath it are also a font thing, and if I equip something that has a sword charge meter on it, that also has a little font element for it. So that is the like simple shader, and then there is something that is made on similar tech, which is the item icon versus weapon model thing, which is just something that uses the projection matrix to detect whether an item is being rendered in the inventory or anywhere else. And if it's rendered in the inventory, I delete any opacity that is 253. So alpha value 253 gets deleted in the inventory, and in world, I delete alpha value 254. So that's just how I do that. It's a fairly simple shader. And then the last bit of shader tech, which is the one that I think is the most interesting. I'm going to give myself a trapped chest, and you'll see why here shortly. If I go ahead and place this. I'm just going to right-click this, and now I have a completely different view of the world. This trap chest here, which is a chest that has not been opened yet, is flashing, as well as the spawners up there on that bridge are flashing at me. And any entities, if there were any in the world, if I go ahead and summon a husk here, is also highlighted. So that is the lens. Now, how I did this is I activate a boss bar that has world fog on it, and I can detect the change in basically all core shaders. And on some of the shaders, I have some way of marking it, like the cutout shader, which is the shader that has spawners on it. I have a thing that marks the spawners specifically. I have alpha value 254 will tell the shader that it needs to activate the highlighting on the spawner. So that's how that works. I do the same thing on the entity shader, but in reverse, because I don't want shulker boxes specifically to get highlighted. So that's just that. The blinking is just a basic sine wave with a high power being multiplied, or it's being powered by like a power of 8 or something, so that every bump on the sine wave is a distinct, like, sharp up and down, and there's 2 of those per second. And I have the flashing synchronized with the sound by reading the game time in the shader and in game. Those are 2 values that are always going, or basically always going to be synchronized, so I can reliably assume that the sound and visuals for this are lined up. So I have a nice like effect there where chests and spawners sort of have that heartbeat sound on them. And that's the main shader tech. And I believe that is everything I wanted to sort of just go over on this. There's a few other things. There's some loot table tech I do, which I probably should just make its own video on because I think it's interesting. I made a library for loot tables. I might make a video on that. If it's not been obvious, I've been gone for a while. It's mostly because this is my job now. I'm doing Minecraft coding of sorts. I do data pack work for YouTubers, and I've been doing it full-time as my only source of income since February of 2021. So I've been a little busy, but I don't know. Videos might or might not be a regular occurrence. We'll see. But yeah, that's basically everything I wanted to cover about this map. If you want to check it out, as I said, it'll be in the description down below. It is a very difficult map, so keep that in mind. But yeah, thanks for watching, and I will catch y'all next time.